The Little Mermaid, Part 3. When at last the magic potion was ready, it looked like the clearest water. The witch handed it to the little mermaid. She then gently touched the little mermaid's lips, and at that very moment the little mermaid lost her voice. The little mermaid passed quickly through the wood and the marsh, and between the rushing whirlpools. She saw that in her father's palace the torches in the ballroom were extinguished, and all within asleep. But she did not venture to go into them, for now she was unable to speak, and going to leave them forever. She felt as if her heart would break. She stole into the garden, took a flower from the flower beds of each of her sisters, kissed her hand 1,000 times towards the palace, and then rose up through the dark blue waters. The sun had not yet risen when she came in sight of the prince's palace and approached the beautiful marble steps, but the moon shone clear and bright. Then the little mermaid drank the magic potion, and it seemed as if a two-edged sword went through her delicate body. She fell into a swoon and lay like one left of spirit. When the sun arose and shone over the sea, she recovered and felt a sharp pain, but just before her stood the handsome young prince. He fixed his cold black eyes upon her so intensely that she cast down her own, and then became aware that her fish's tail was gone, and that she had as pretty a pair of legs and tiny feet as any little maiden could have. But she had no clothes, and so wrapped herself in her long, thick hair. The prince asked who she was and where she had come from, and she looked at him mildly and sorrowfully with her deep eyes, but she could not speak. Every step she took was as the witch had said it would be. She felt as if treading upon the points of needles or sharp knives, but she bore it willingly and stepped as lightly by the prince's side as a soap bubble, so that he and all who saw her wondered at her graceful swaying movements. She was very soon arrayed in costly robes of silk and muslin, and was the most beautiful creature in the palace, yet unable to speak or sing. Beautiful female servants dressed her in silk and gold, stepping forward and sang before the prince and his royal parents. One sang better than all the others, and the prince clapped his hands and smiled at her. This was great sorrow to the little mermaid. She knew how much more sweetly she herself could sing once, and she thought if only he would know that, he would love her forever. The slaves next performed some pretty fairy-like dances to the sound of beautiful music. Then the little mermaid raised her lovely white arms, stood on the tips of her toes, and glided over the floor and danced as no one yet had been able to dance. At each moment her beauty became more revealed, and her expressive eyes appealed more directly to the heart than the songs of the slaves. Everyone was enchanted, especially the prince, who called her his little foundling, and she danced again quite readily to please him, though each time her foot touched the floor it seemed as if she stood on a sharp knife. The prince said she should remain with him always, and she received permission to sleep at his door on a velvet cushion. He had a page's dress made for her, then she might accompany him on horseback. They rode together through the sweet-scented woods, where the green boughs touched their shoulders and the little birds sang among the fresh leaves. She climbed with the prince to the tops of high mountains, and although her tender feet bled so that even her steps were marked, she only laughed and followed him till they could see the clouds beneath them, looking like a flock of birds travelling to distant lands. While at the prince's palace, and when all the household were asleep, she would go and sit on the broad marble steps, for it eased her burning feet to bath them in the cold sea water, and then she thought of all those below in the deep. Once during the night her sisters came up arm in arm, singing sorrowfully as they floated on the water. She beckoned to them, and then they recognized her and told her how she had grieved them. After that, they came to the same place every night, and once she saw them in the distance, her old grandmother with them, who had not been to the surface of the sea for many years, and the old sea king, her father, with his crown on his head. They stretched out their hands towards her, but they did not venture so near the land as the sisters did. As the days passed, she loved the prince more fondly, and he loved her as he would love anyone so beautiful, but it never came to his head to make her his wife. Yet, unless he married her, she could not receive an immortal soul, and on the morning after his marriage with another, she would dissolve into the foam of the sea. "Do you not love me the best of all?" her eyes would beckon, when he took her in his arms and kissed her on her forehead.
"To me you are so dear,"
said the prince,
"for you have the best heart, and you are the most devoted to me. You are like a young maiden whom I saw once, but whom I shall never see again. I was in a ship that was wrecked, and the waves cast me ashore near a holy temple, where several young maidens performed the service. The youngest of them found me on the shore and saved my life. I saw her but once, and she is the only one in the world whom I could love. But you are like her, and you have almost driven her image out of my mind. She belongs in the holy temple, and my good fortune has sent you to me instead of her, and we will never part."
All these things the prince thought over and over again. The little mermaid thought about how she had carried him over the sea to the wood where the temple stood, how she sat beneath the foam and watched till the human beings came to help him. The little mermaid also thought of the beautiful maiden, who the prince no doubt loved more than her. The mermaid sighed deeply, but she could not shed tears. "He says the maiden belongs to the holy temple, therefore she will never return to the world. They will meet no more while I am by his side, and I see him every day. I will take care of him and love him, and give up my life for his sake, if only he knew." Very soon it was said that the prince must marry, and that the beautiful daughter of a neighboring king would be his wife, for a fine ship was being fitted out. Although the prince gave out that he merely intended to pay a visit to the king, it was generally supposed that he really went to see his daughter. A great company were to go with him. The little mermaid smiled and shook her head. She knew the prince's thoughts better than any of the others. The prince told her that he must travel to see his beautiful princess, that his parents wanted it, and he was obliged to bring her home as his bride. He could not love her. She was not like the beautiful maiden in the temple. If he were forced to choose a bride, he would rather choose her. But she could not speak, yet had those expressive eyes. Then the prince kissed her rosy mouth, played with her long hair, and laid his head on her heart, while she dreamed of human happiness and an immortal soul. The prince knew that she was not afraid of the sea, as they stood on the deck of the noble ship, which was to carry them to the country of the neighboring king. And then he told her of the storm and of calm, of strange fishes in the deep beneath them, and of the water the divers had seen there. She smiled at his descriptions, for she knew better than anyone what wonders were at the bottom. In the moonlight, when all on board were asleep, excepting the man of the helm who was steering, she sat on the deck, gazing down through the clear water. She thought she could distinguish her father's castle, and upon it her aged grandmother, with a silver crown on her head, looking through the rushing tide at the keel of the vessel. Then her sisters came up the waves, and gazed at her mournfully, wringing their hands. She beckoned to them and smiled, and wanted to tell them how happy and well off she was. But the cabin boy approached, and when he saw the sisters dive down, he thought it was only the foam of the sea which he saw. The next morning the ship sailed into the harbour of a beautiful town belonging to the king whom the prince was going to visit. The church bells were ringing, and the high towers sounded a flourish of trumpets, and soldiers with flying colours and glittering bayonets lined the rocks through which they passed. Every day was a festival. Balls and entertainments followed one another. But the princess had not yet appeared. People said that she was being brought up and educated in a religious house, where she was learning every royal virtue. At last she came. Then the little mermaid, who was very anxious to see whether she was really beautiful, was obliged to acknowledge that she had never seen a more perfect vision of beauty. Her skin was delicately fair, and beneath her long dark eyelashes were laughing blue eyes that shone with truth and purity.
"It was you who saved my life when I lay dead on the beach,"
said the prince, and he folded his blushing bride in his arms.
"Oh, I am too happy. My fondest hopes are all fulfilled. You will rejoice at my happiness, for your devotion to me is great and sincere."
The little mermaid watched in despair. His wedding morning would bring death to her, and she would change into foam and lay on the sea forever. All the church bells rung, and the heralds rode about the town proclaiming the betrothal. Perfumed oil was burning in costly silver lamps on every altar. The priests waved their censers, while the bride and bridegroom joined their hands and received the blessing of the bishop. The little mermaid, dressed in silk and gold, held up the bride's train, but her ears heard nothing of the festive music, and her eyes saw not the holy ceremony. She thought of the night of death which was coming to her, and of all she had lost in the world. On the same evening, the bride and bridegroom went on board ship. Cannons were roaring, flags waving, and in the center of the ship a costly tent of purple and gold had been erected. It contained elegant couches for the reception of the bridal pair during the night. The ship, with the swelling sails and a favorable wind, glided away smoothly and lightly over the calm sea. When it grew dark, a number of colored lamps were lit, and the sailors danced merrily on the deck. The little mermaid could not help thinking of her first rising out of the sea, when she had seen similar festivities and joys, and she joined in the dance, poised herself in the air as a swallow when he pursues his prey, and all present cheered her with wonder. She had never danced so elegantly before. Her tender feet felt as if it were cut with sharp knives, but she cared not for it. A sharper pang had pierced through her heart. She knew this was the last evening she should ever see the prince, for whom she had forsaken her kindred and her home. She had given up her beautiful voice and suffered unheard of pain daily for him, while he knew nothing of it. This was the last evening that she would breathe the same air with him, or gaze at the starry sky and the deep sea. An eternal night without a thought or a dream awaited her. She had no soul, and now she could never win one. All was joy and gaiety on board ship till long after midnight. She laughed and danced with the rest, while the thoughts of death were in her heart. The prince kissed his beautiful bride, while she played with his raven hair, till they went arm in arm to rest in the splendid tent. Then all became still on board the ship. The helmsman stood at the helm. The little mermaid leaned her white arms on the edge of the vessel and looked towards the east for the first blush of morning, for that first ray of dawn would bring her death. She saw her sisters rising out of the flood. They were as pale as herself, but their long beautiful hair waved no more in the wind, and had been cut off.
"We have given our hair to the witch to obtain help for you, that you may not die tonight. She has given us a knife. Here it is. See, it is very sharp. Before the sun rises, you must plunge it into the heart of the prince. When the warm blood falls upon your feet, They will grow together and form into the fish's tail, and you will once more be a mermaid, and return to us to live out your 300 years before you die and change into the salt sea foam. Haste then, he or you must die before sunrise. Our grandmother mourns so for you, that her white hair is falling off from sorrow, as ours fell under the witch's scissors. The prince must live no longer. Come back, hasten. Do not see the first red streaks in the sky. In a few minutes the sun will rise, and you must die.
And then they sighed deeply and mournfully and sank down beneath the waves. The little mermaid drew back the crimson curtain of the tent and beheld the fair bride with her head resting on the prince's chest. For only but a moment the little mermaid stood still in confusion. What should she do? End of part 3.